The USS Alden Ridge left Pearl Harbor just after dawn on a humid April morning in 1943, sliding away from the pier as slowly and silently as a shadow. Families stood on the dock, waving in that tense way people did during wartime, faces smiling, eyes terrified, hands trembling only after the submarine drifted too far for anyone to notice. For many of them, this was a familiar ritual. Some had been through multiple departures. Others were new to it, still trying to understand how a body can feel pride and dread at the same time. One mother clutched a letter so tightly that the ink had smudged, reading it again and again until the submarine finally slipped behind the breakwater and vanished into open water. Aboard the vessel, 71 sailors settled into the cramped, metallic world that would hold them for weeks. The Alden Ridge was considered reliable on paper, but every man on that boat knew its hidden quirks. The forward ballast system had been flagged twice for inconsistent pressure readings. The electrical board had sparked during shore tests. Even the diving planes had a reputation for sticking at the worst possible moments. Still, it had never failed during combat, and most crew members trusted the submarine in the same way a soldier trusts his rifle. Imperfect, but familiar enough to feel safe. The mission was simple, at least, simple by wartime standards. Patrol the Central Pacific, look for enemy supply routes, and capture intelligence if luck allowed. The men joked as they stowed equipment, bumping their shoulders in narrow passageways, trying to forget the stories circulating among other subs that had never returned. Every submarine crew lived with the knowledge that if their vessel failed, if something misfired, if one enemy plane spotted them, if the hull cracked at depth, there would be no rescue, no recovery, no goodbye. A submarine lost at sea was a grave sealed forever. Yet that morning, morale was higher than anyone expected. The cook had made cinnamon rolls with rationed sugar. The air smelled warm and sweet as the boat left harbor. A young sailor named Thompson passed them out with a grin, proud of the treat he'd managed to pull off. Another sailor, Harding, secretly carried a small camera in his locker. He hoped to take a photo of the crew on deck at sunset. Several men were planning what they'd do during shore leave when they returned. One wanted to marry his fiancée. Another dreamed of opening a garage. Small plans, fragile plans, but necessary ones. They gave meaning to the long hours underwater. Once they reached open sea, the submarine descended, and daylight disappeared almost instantly. Inside, the atmosphere changed. Voices dropped to quiet murmurs. The gentle hum of machinery filled every corner. The hull creaked occasionally with pressure shifts, producing sounds that even seasoned sailors couldn't fully ignore. It was in those moments that men remembered how thin the barrier was between them and the crushing weight of the Pacific. The first days of the patrol were uneventful. The submarine reported calm seas, steady progress, and no enemy contact. Routine daily transmissions reached command without issue. The crew ran drills, maintaining discipline. Some wrote letters they knew might not reach home for weeks. Others tried to sleep, though the heat, the metal bunks, and the constant machinery made rest shallow. These were the normal rhythms of submarine life, the ones men slipped into without thinking. But beneath that routine, hints of unease were rising. Officers noticed the ballast indicators flickering intermittently. The chief engineer recorded a slight burning odor near the electrical panel during a power shift. The dive officer reported a momentary delay in the bow planes during a test maneuver. None of it was catastrophic. None of it was enough to turn back. But together, it created a quiet tension that crept through the crew like a cold draft. On the seventh day, the Alden Ridge reported something unusual. Just before midnight, a short message came through the radio, possible shadow trailing, investigating. It was terse, almost too controlled, the kind of sentence that carried more fear than it admitted. Submariners didn't send vague reports unless they had to. A shadow could mean many things: an enemy ship, a sonar echo, a mistaken reading, or something unknown in waters where visibility was poor and navigation could be unreliable. Command received the message at 00:23 hours and responded immediately, asking for clarification. But the reply never came. Operators tried again 5 minutes later, then 10, then 30, nothing. At first, no one panicked. Radio issues weren't uncommon. Interference, equipment overload, even atmospheric conditions could delay communications. But as hours passed without a single ping, the tone in the communications room shifted from routine to dread. By dawn, the Navy initiated a priority signal request, an urgent call requiring an immediate acknowledgement from the submarine. The Alden Ridge stayed silent. A second request followed, then a third. Each one vanished into the void. Officers at Pearl Harbor exchanged uneasy glances. Someone pulled the last transmission and read it again, trying to find meaning in the words. Possible shadow trailing, investigating. The phrasing sounded cautious, almost hesitant, not the confident report of a submarine tracking a known enemy. It read more like uncertainty, like the crew was aware of something they couldn't yet define. As morning stretched into afternoon, the lack of contact became impossible to ignore. Other submarines in nearby sectors were contacted to monitor for distress signals or unusual noise patterns, but they reported only open water and static. No explosions, no sonar anomalies, nothing to suggest a battle or mechanical catastrophe. It was as if the Alden Ridge had slipped beneath the surface and simply disappeared. Families were not notified, not yet. The Navy did not declare a vessel missing until every possibility had been exhausted. But on the docks and in the small neighborhoods near the base, people felt when something was wrong. Wives noticed officers speaking quietly with one another. Children noticed their fathers coming home late from shifts, faces pale and drawn. Rumors spread quickly. Someone claimed they'd overheard that a submarine hadn't checked in. Someone else said they saw search planes lifting off early. None of it could be confirmed, but the air around Pearl Harbor felt heavier, like the humidity before a storm. Among the officers, theories began forming quickly. A mechanical failure was the first and most logical. The Alden Ridge had known issues, and even a small electrical fire could disable critical systems without leaving any trace detectable from the surface. Another possibility was an accident during a rapid dive. Submarines sometimes misjudge depth, and if the diving plane stuck, the boat could plunge too steeply to recover. Enemy action was also considered. Japanese patrols roamed those waters, and though captured records wouldn't be available until after the war, the threat was always present. A single depth charge or aerial bomb could destroy a submarine instantly. But even those scenarios usually left evidence. Oil slicks, debris, a signal echo, something. This disappearance had none of those markers. The absence itself became the mystery. Inside the command center, officers gathered around a chart marking the submarine's intended route. Red pins showed its last confirmed coordinates. The line extending from that point turned into a dotted path, an estimate of where the sub would have traveled next. Somewhere along that invisible path, something had gone terribly wrong. They scheduled search sorties, issued emergency orders, redirected nearby vessels. Every step followed the book. Every response reflected the urgency. But hour after hour, nothing surfaced. The ocean remained impenetrably silent. As darkness fell again that night, no one dared say the words out loud, but they all felt the same weight. Submarines didn't vanish without explanation. Something had happened, something fast, something that left no trace. And yet, without evidence, they couldn't know, couldn't even guess, whether the crew had fought for hours or seconds, whether they had time to understand what was happening, whether anyone reached for the radio a final time as the bow tilted into darkness. The unanswered questions hung over the command like a fog, heavy and suffocating. By the next morning, the Alden Ridge was officially overdue. Protocol required one final series of long-range radio attempts. Each call was sent with growing desperation, stretched across frequencies and wavelengths. Each one echoed out into the Pacific and faded unanswered. The submarine that had left Pearl Harbor full of life, noise, heat, and human hope was now only a line on a chart and a silence in the sea. No one knew then that 77 years would pass before anyone would see it again, standing upright on the ocean floor like a monument frozen in time. But in those first hours, all anyone could do was wait and wonder what the crew had faced in their final moments beneath the waves. And as the search began in earnest, a darker question simmered under every conversation. Had the submarine been lost to the mechanical failures everyone had ignored? Or had the shadow mentioned in that final message been something far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit? When the USS Alden Ridge missed its third scheduled transmission, the Navy wasted no time. Within hours, officers at Pearl Harbor authorized a full search, one that would become one of the largest submarine hunts in the Pacific that entire year. It began quietly at first, a handful of reconnaissance planes sweeping low segments of open water, engines echoing across the surface as pilots scanned for anything, an oil slick, air bubbles, drifting debris, anything that might hint at where the submarine had gone. What they found was nothing but a dark, wind-brushed sea stretching endlessly in every direction. Destroyers were the next to deploy, cutting across the Pacific with speed that betrayed the tension brewing on every deck. Crews leaned over railings during shifts, staring at the ocean as if they could force it to give up its secrets. In the control rooms, sonar technicians listened for the faintest echo. Submarine wrecks sometimes emitted trapped air for hours or even days after sinking. The Alden Ridge produced nothing. Not a thump, not a hiss, not a single unnatural reverberation in the water column. By the second day of the search, the Navy had widened the radius. The official assumption was cautious. Perhaps mechanical issues had forced the submarine off its planned route before radio silence set in. But the unspoken fear was darker, that whatever happened had been sudden and devastating enough to disable all communication instantly. Crews aboard the search ships noticed the shift in tone. Officers spoke quietly among themselves. Reports were written with colder language. Protocol replaced hope. Families were not told the full situation yet, but word traveled quickly in military towns. Wives waiting for the afternoon mail noticed uniformed men walking briskly between administrative buildings. A young woman overheard two sailors wondering why so many planes were taking off before dawn. In small wooden houses just outside the base, mothers sat beside radios, pretending not to check them, pretending not to listen for any mention of a submarine gone missing. They tried to convince themselves that no news was normal, but deep down, everyone felt the crack in the air, the kind that appears just before a truth no one wants to face. Back in the Pacific, the search group expanded again. Allied intelligence stations in Australia and Midway were contacted. Even British intercept stations were asked to check for unusual signals. If the Alden Ridge had suffered an equipment failure, sometimes signals drifted off frequency. If the submarine had surfaced after a malfunction, it might have been spotted. But every message came back the same: negative contact. On the third day, a destroyer reported a faint concentration of oil on the surface, almost enough to spark a moment of hope. Hope in wartime often meant clarity, even if the clarity was grim. A sample was collected and analyzed on board. The results came back quickly: whale oil, not fuel. It was a false alarm. As the days began to bleed together, frustration spread through the search fleet. Officers pored over navigation charts, recalculating drift patterns, studying ocean currents, attempting to approximate where a submarine in distress might have traveled. They ran the math again and again, reaching the same infuriating conclusion: there were too many possibilities and too few clues. By the end of the first week, the operation had widened to cover nearly 10,000 square miles of ocean. Aircraft flew so low their shadows skimmed the waves. Destroyers dropped listening equipment into the water at precise intervals, waiting in absolute silence for any trace of metallic resonance. Submarines that were part of the larger Pacific Fleet were quietly asked to keep watch for wreckage during their own patrols. Some complied officially. Others did so out of loyalty, scanning the horizon during periscope sweeps, even though they knew chances were near zero. The absence of evidence became its own suffocating presence. When the Navy finally notified families, the language was measured and familiar, crafted through years of practice, but impossible to soften. Overdue but not declared lost. Search ongoing. No confirmed incident. These phrases landed like blows. Some family members accepted them with silent nods. Others burst into tears as soon as the officer left their doorstep. One woman reportedly fainted. A father shattered a photo frame in anger after the door closed. For younger siblings who didn't understand the wording, all they could grasp was that something had gone wrong. At official briefings, the Navy stressed that the Pacific was vast and unpredictable. Ships disappeared without trace more often than civilians realized. Submarines were even more vulnerable. Pressure, depth, machinery, weather. Any number of factors could doom a vessel before anyone on board knew what had happened. But behind the podiums, away from reporters and military families, officers debated in more painful detail. Some argued that the Alden Ridge must have suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. The electrical issues logged before departure suddenly mattered more. The ballast concerns no longer seemed minor. If the submarine had flooded or lost power while diving, it could have plunged faster than the crew could react, reaching crush depth within minutes. A failure like that would leave no debris, only silence. Others believed the submarine had been attacked. Japanese aircraft patrolled certain sectors aggressively, and destroyer escorts were known to drop depth charges without warning. If the Alden Ridge had been caught near the surface, it could have been destroyed instantly. But even that theory had cracks. Intercepted Japanese records captured periodically throughout 1943 mention no confirmed hits on an American submarine in that region. Enemy crews usually logged such victories carefully. They were used for propaganda, morale, and record-keeping. The absence of any Japanese report raised doubts. Among the submarine community, rumors took on a life of their own. Sailors swapping stories during late-night shifts claimed that the Alden Ridge had always been a jinxed boat. Some said they'd heard the dive officer complaining about sluggish hydraulics days before the final patrol. Others whispered that the boat had a design flaw no one wanted to admit publicly. One rumor insisted the submarine had gone too steep during a dive, plunging like a stone, while the crew fought desperately to level it. Another claimed an internal battery explosion might have filled the compartments with smoke in seconds, blinding the crew and knocking out power. Every explanation felt possible, but none felt convincing. They were guesses in the dark, shaped by fear and the need for answers. Weeks passed. The search, once fierce and hopeful, began to lose momentum. Fuel supplies ran thin. Aircraft needed maintenance. Waters shifted with storms. One by one, ships were reassigned. The Pacific, already filled with tragedy, reclaimed the search area as if nothing had happened. Officially, the Alden Ridge was declared lost with all hands on the 57th day. The announcement was short, read by a tired officer in a crisp uniform whose voice wavered only once. Afterward, he folded the report and placed it among others that carried the same fate. Families held private memorials. Some clung to hope longer than others. A widow kept her porch light on each night for 3 years. A mother refused to remove her son's shoes from the hallway. A younger brother enlisted in the Navy just to stand near the ocean that had taken someone he idolized. Time moved forward, but grief anchored them in place. The Navy released an official summary months later, cause of loss undetermined. It was the most honest sentence they could give. Then the war ended, and a new wave of hope briefly emerged. Japanese military archives were seized, including detailed logs of naval operations, air patrols, and anti-submarine attacks. Historians pored over them, page by page, looking for any mention of an American vessel matching the Alden Ridge's route or timeline. They found dozens of engagements, hundreds of recorded sightings, and endless references to submarines. But not a single entry matched the disappearance. No Japanese pilot reported hitting a submarine in that area. No destroyer logged depth charges deployed on the date the Alden Ridge vanished. Instead of answers, the archives delivered an eerie confirmation. The enemy hadn't been responsible. For some families, this brought relief. For others, it deepened the wound. They had spent years believing a battle had taken their loved ones. Learning it might have been a mechanical failure or something else entirely made the loss feel even more senseless. As decades passed, the mystery transformed. It became a ghost story within naval circles, a case officers referenced quietly whenever a submarine reported equipment issues. The Alden Ridge was a warning, a reminder of how quickly a routine patrol could spiral into an unsolved tragedy. But the families never let it fade. At reunions and memorials, they spoke of sons and brothers and husbands with tears that still welled decades later. They collected fragments of information like puzzle pieces from a box missing half its parts. They wrote to the Navy every few years, asking if anything new had surfaced. They watched documentaries about lost vessels, hoping one might mention a detail that fit. None ever did. And through all of it, across wartime, peacetime, generations of search technology, the Pacific kept its secret. The ocean that swallowed the Alden Ridge never once offered a clue, never once gave back a piece of metal or a scrap of fabric. Not a single trace broke the surface. The absence became its own kind of story, one that haunted descendants long after the war itself had faded from public memory. And for those who still waited for closure, the silence felt like an answer in itself, one that hurt more than any confirmed tragedy ever could. No one knew then that the truth was still waiting far below, sealed in darkness, standing upright on the seabed where no one expected to find anything at all. In the years that followed the disappearance of the USS Alden Ridge, the Pacific War raged on, consuming headlines and attention, and eventually ending with the world too exhausted to look back at every mystery left behind. But the silence surrounding the submarine did not fade. It simply settled, year after year, into something heavier. Officially, the Navy listed the Alden Ridge as lost with all hands. Unofficially, it became one of the most persistent cold cases in American naval history, a puzzle suspended in the deep that no one could solve and few were willing to confront. The ocean had taken the vessel, and for decades no one could even say where. Through the 1940s and 1950s, the families of the 71 sailors clung to whatever scraps of information the Navy released, most of them dry, technical summaries that said little and explained even less. The reports confirmed that no enemy action had been detected, no distress signal had been received, and no mechanical failure had been logged after departure. Beyond that, they offered nothing. Some families kept the reports in drawers or safety boxes. Others hid them away, unable to read them without reopening wounds. During reunions or informal gatherings, they traded rumors, claims that the Alden Ridge had been the subject of an unreleased investigation, or that someone in the Navy knew more than they admitted. Each rumor faded as quickly as it arose, leaving behind a deeper sense of helplessness. By the 1960s, declassification policies changed, allowing reporters and researchers to sift through older wartime documents. Among them were fragments about the Alden Ridge, memos referencing experimental sonar equipment tested on a small number of submarines that year. The documents didn't name the vessel outright, but one memo contained a technical note identical to a component known to have been installed on the Alden Ridge before its final patrol. It was a sonar prototype, designed to help detect long-range movement, but it was also known to interfere with electrical circuits under stress. The possibility that malfunctioning sonar had overloaded systems inside the submarine took hold among enthusiasts and some former naval engineers. It wasn't a proven theory, but it was more than the families had been given in decades. At the same time, in the fading years of World War II veterans, one survivor from another submarine, USS Halcyon, shared a story during a reunion dinner. He claimed that months before its disappearance, the Alden Ridge had experienced a troubling ballast issue during a rapid dive exercise. According to him, the forward ballast tank had stuck temporarily, causing the submarine to pitch downward at an unsafe angle before leveling out. The Alden Ridge had completed the exercise and returned without incident, but the crew had reportedly joked that the boat liked to dive harder than it should. Most veterans dismissed the story as an exaggeration, but the survivor insisted it had happened, and that the issue had been noted in a quiet maintenance log that never made it into official reports. For the families, these scattered revelations were like whispers from a locked room, sounds that hinted at a truth they still couldn't reach. By the 1970s, many of the parents of the lost sailors were gone. The weight of the unanswered questions passed down to siblings, children, and even grandchildren who had never met the men trapped inside the mystery. They carried the grief differently. Instead of waiting for answers, some decided to pursue them. They formed the Alden Ridge Families Association, a small but determined group of relatives who met twice a year in halls, basements, and community centers. They collected photos, stories, technical documents, and letters written from the submarine before it vanished. They wrote to senators, naval historians, and investigative journalists, and they refused to allow the case to disappear into military archives. By the 1980s, the association had grown into something more organized. They connected with oceanographers and early deep-sea explorers fascinated by unsolved wrecks. Technology was improving, sonar was sharper, mapping more precise, but the ocean floors of the Pacific still remained some of the least explored places on Earth. Ship after ship passed through those waters, none coming close to the submarine's grave. Even if search crews knew the exact location to look, the depth alone could exceed the capabilities of most civilian operations. Despite this, civilian search groups began forming around the mystery. Some were composed of retired military personnel, others of engineers and enthusiasts who studied unexplained disappearances. A few were motivated by the desire to make names for themselves in the world of deep-sea discovery. But for a handful of them, the case of the Alden Ridge became something deeply personal, an unsolved wound they couldn't ignore. They studied the final transmission of the submarine word by word, trying to interpret the tone of the message. They memorized ocean currents from 1943. They interviewed surviving veterans from other submarines, gathering accounts of the patrol zone as if piecing together a forensic map of a crime scene decades old. Some expeditions attempted preliminary searches, but they were all hindered by the same unforgiving obstacle. The Pacific was too vast, its seafloor too uneven, its trenches too deep. Sonar equipment of the era struggled to differentiate between geological ridges and man-made structures. Storms disrupted progress. Funding dried up. Several of the early expeditions returned with nothing more than blurry sonar returns and increasing frustration. Through the 1990s, technology made massive leaps. The Cold War had driven deep-sea advancements, some of which filtered into civilian hands. Remotely operated vehicles could now descend farther than ever before, and detailed mapping became more achievable. The families, now several generations deep, renewed their campaign. They wrote to universities and research labs. They pushed for grants. They appealed to naval officials to release any remaining classified documents relating to the submarine's equipment, route, and mechanical issues. Many officials responded sympathetically, but most replied with bureaucratic phrasing that offered no new clarity. Yet slowly, patterns emerged. Several declassified engineering logs from 1943, released after years of requests, confirmed that the Alden Ridge had indeed undergone corrective maintenance for its forward ballast system. The logs didn't confirm a failure, but they did corroborate the survivor's account that the ballast had been sticking during test dives. Another document, dated just weeks before the submarine left Pearl Harbor, referenced an electrical recalibration connected to the sonar system. The possibility that a malfunction in either of those systems had contributed to the loss began to feel less like speculation and more like a missing piece of a long-buried truth. Meanwhile, a new kind of group entered the picture: modern deep-sea explorers. Some were inspired by famous wreck discoveries from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Others had backgrounds in marine robotics or advanced sonar imaging. They saw the Alden Ridge not just as a mystery, but as a challenge, a vessel swallowed by one of the toughest regions of the Pacific, with a vanishing point as vague as a fading memory. Among these searchers were a few individuals whose obsession with the submarine bordered on personal crusade. One oceanographer in particular, Dr. Henry Claiborne, spent nearly 2 decades collecting data from old naval charts, comparing them against drift models created through modern software. He believed the submarine's likely descent point had been miscalculated in the 1940s due to limited understanding of underwater currents. Claiborne approached the family's association during a summer meeting held in a quiet veterans' hall. He stood before the group, now composed mostly of gray-haired children of the lost sailors and their grown children, and presented a theory. The Alden Ridge, he believed, had sunk farther west than anyone had previously estimated, its descent pulled by a deep subsurface current that wasn't mapped until the 1990s. He showed them diagrams, old patrol routes, and calculations that had taken him years to refine. Some in the room wept, not because they understood every detail, but because it was the first credible lead they had heard in decades. With enough support, Claiborne organized an expedition in the early 2000s. It involved chartered vessels, state-of-the-art sonar, and a team of experts who hoped, truly hoped, to bring closure to generations of waiting. The families followed every update. They checked emails constantly, kept phones charged, and sat through nights imagining what might be found. But when the expedition began scanning the depths, they encountered unexpected geological formations, towering underwater ridges that confused sonar and created shadows large enough to mask entire ships. The ocean swallowed every signal they sent down. After 3 weeks of searching, the expedition returned empty-handed. It was the closest anyone had ever come, and the failure left a bruise on everyone involved. Still, no one gave up. The families continued meeting, holding onto stories of the men whose names had nearly been absorbed into the margins of history. Children who had once played under tables during association gatherings now sat in chairs with notebooks, taking these stories into their own hands. Grandchildren carried the names of the lost sailors, some named directly after the men the ocean had taken. And as the new generation of searchers emerged, armed with better technology, greater precision, and a determination sharpened by decades of failure, they inherited not just a mystery, but the weight of an entire lineage of grief. They believed, perhaps more intensely than anyone before them, that the Alden Ridge was still out there, waiting to be found. They believed the truth had not been erased, only buried. The case never grew cold for them. It grew louder, and beneath the surface of the Pacific, far below where anyone had yet looked, something still waited in the dark, upright and strangely intact, holding answers that had slept in silence for 77 years. When the oceanographic team began their deep scan mapping project in the spring of 2020, none of them were thinking about lost submarines or unsolved wartime disappearances. Their mission was routine: chart a poorly documented section of the Pacific seafloor for a geological survey. Days of quiet, monotonous mapping produced the same expected shapes: sand channels, collapsed ridges, and the occasional volcanic boulder field. But on a fogless morning in June, the technician monitoring the sonar feed froze in place. On the screen, rising like a digital ghost from the abyss, was a vertical shape that shouldn't have been there. A narrow column, straight, symmetrical, and unmistakably metallic. It measured more than 200 feet high before disappearing into the silt floor. For several seconds, no one spoke. The room stayed quiet except for the hum of processors and the rhythmic ticking of the depth gauge. The first reaction was disbelief. One of the lead analysts tried recalibrating the system, convinced it was a misread, a software artifact or echo distortion caused by a nearby trench. But recalibration changed nothing. The object remained, a tall, rigid outline that was far too precise to be geological. The longer they stared, the clearer it became this was manufactured, human, and very old. Their instruments estimated a depth of just under 3,000 feet, well beyond what early 20th century vessels could normally survive if they'd suffered catastrophic failure. One of the researchers, a retired maritime historian, leaned in close and whispered that only a few things from that era were long enough to match the dimensions. A cruiser's mast, perhaps, or a submarine standing vertical, which made even less sense. Speculation erupted within the team, but doubt smothered every theory. No one had ever documented a submarine resting upright like that. They were designed to fall sideways when they hit the bottom, to collapse under their own weight like a felled timber. Upright meant something else, either slow descent, controlled descent, or a physics-defying fluke that bordered on impossible. Still, they bookmarked the coordinates, marked the anomaly, and spent the night poring over old maritime loss records. It was the historian who found the matching length first, 225 feet. That number stood out like a siren. It matched one particular American submarine from World War II that had never been found. A vessel that had simply vanished 7 decades earlier during a patrol no one ever fully understood. The USS Alden Ridge. The moment the name circulated around the research vessel, everything changed. Emails were drafted, calls were made, protocol demanded they contact the Navy, and within hours the discovery was routed through multiple departments, then reviewed, then escalated. The team was told to hold position and stand by for instructions. For the rest of the night, the crew hovered over the coordinates, staring into the black water that hid whatever was beneath them. Some felt excitement rising through the ship like heat. Others felt unease, a few felt dread, no one slept well. By morning, the Navy had formally acknowledged the sonar hit. They didn't confirm it was the Alden Ridge, but the unspoken understanding swept through the research vessel. No other missing submarine of that exact size remained unaccounted for in that region. The Navy's message was short, controlled, and strangely calm, instructing the team to prepare for the arrival of a remotely operated vehicle. It would be flown out within 48 hours. The oceanographic crew agreed to assist, although several admitted later they had never felt such tension in the air, like they had stumbled into a story far heavier than the expedition they'd signed up for. The ROV arrived packed inside a steel container, handled with the kind of care normally reserved for classified equipment. Navy technicians came aboard, briefed the team, and began calibrating the vehicle for extreme depth. By dusk, preparations were complete. The water was calm. The sky was unnaturally clear, the horizon fading into a seamless black as the sun sank. Everyone gathered around the screens as the ROV slipped into the ocean and began its descent. As it dropped through the first 1,000 feet, the world above grew silent. The deeper it went, the more the darkness thickened, swallowing the lights that trailed behind the cables. There was no sound except the faint rustle of the tether spooling off its reel. 2,000 feet passed, then 2,500. Instruments pinged quietly in the background, tracking movement, adjusting the descent path. People leaned closer to the monitors, waiting for the moment the unknown finally came into view. When the vehicle reached 2,800 feet, the technician slowed its descent, letting the thrusters stabilize. The live feed flickered as particles of drifting sediment shimmered across the camera like drifting snow. Then someone inhaled sharply. A dark shape began forming through the haze. The keel appeared first, a narrow line rising vertically from the seabed, impossible and surreal. The submarine stood straight up, balanced on its nose like a steel monument. The bow was buried deep in the silt, but the rest of the vessel rose perfectly vertical, extending the full 225 feet into the water above. The ROV's lights swept along the hull, revealing the faded outline of hull plates, the corroded steel beginning to flake away after 77 years, and the faint, ghostly letters barely visible under layers of marine growth. A LDENRIDGE, the room filled with a stunned kind of silence, half sorrow, half disbelief. The submarine hadn't crumpled. It hadn't imploded outward. From the exterior, it looked untouched. The questions came quickly. If the hull was intact, what had brought it down? Why was it standing upright? Submarines did not behave this way. The pressure at these depths should have crushed the vessel into a collapsed mass of mangled steel, but here it stood like a pillar. One of the Navy technicians stepped closer to the screen and whispered that in his entire career, he had never seen anything close to this. Someone else theorized the submarine must have descended almost perfectly vertical, dropping bow first in a controlled or at least stable orientation. But how could that happen without anyone sending a distress signal? Why didn't the hull show signs of implosion? And how did it land without breaking itself in half? The ROV circled slowly, scanning the conning tower. The periscope was still retracted. The railing remained attached. Even the forward dive planes were still positioned symmetrically. None of it matched the image of a submarine struck by enemy fire. There were no ruptures, no blast patterns, no jagged openings scorched by internal detonation. Instead, the vessel looked frozen in a moment, as though whatever had happened had come without violence, silent and sudden. When the ROV drifted toward the aft section, the camera stopped abruptly. On the starboard side, a long vertical scar ran the length of the hull. It wasn't a rupture. It looked more like the steel had been stressed from within, bowing outward gently but not breaking. The technicians exchanged looks. Pressure damage usually came from catastrophic collapse, not surface-level warping, and yet the hull remained intact. It was as if something had gone wrong inside the submarine that didn't behave like typical flooding or explosion. The most unsettling moment came when the camera approached the main hatches. They were sealed. Every entry point remained locked from the outside. No signs of emergency escape attempts. No damage suggesting the crew had tried to force their way out or equalize pressure. Everything appeared as it would have during a routine patrol. Only now the submarine was entombed in absolute silence, untouched since its final minutes. The Navy officials watching the feed began exchanging quiet observations. Some pointed out the lack of debris. Others noted the absence of anchor lines or recovery markers, meaning the submarine must have descended rapidly and cleanly, leaving nothing behind. The discovery contradicted nearly every theory proposed over the last 7 decades. There was no sign of enemy engagement, no indication of catastrophic mechanical failure visible externally, and no clues explaining the impossible vertical position. The emotional weight began seeping into the room. 71 sailors had vanished inside this steel shell. Families had lived entire lives without answers. Some had died waiting. Now, here it was, resting upright like a grave marker carved from iron. None of the researchers spoke for a long time. Even the Navy representatives seemed uncharacteristically subdued, their faces tightened by a mix of reverence and shock. The ROV descended lower, illuminating the bow. A fine trickle of sediment drifted upward from where the submarine had pierced the seafloor, creating the illusion of the vessel still sinking, still moving even after all these decades. Some of the crew watching admitted later that this moment felt like standing at the edge of a cemetery during a burial. Quiet, heavy, final. But beneath that silence was a rising urgency. The upright orientation wasn't just unusual, it hinted at something that defied established physics of submarine accidents. The data suggested that the Alden Ridge had maintained structural integrity during descent. The bow had penetrated the seabed with enough force to anchor the vessel vertically, yet the rest of the hull showed no signs of collapse or torsion. Whatever had happened had been controlled, or at least uninterrupted, until the very end. And that made the final radio message echo even louder in everyone's minds. Possible shadow trailing, investigating. Those were the last known words sent from the Alden Ridge. And now, looking at the image of that silent, perfectly upright submarine, no one could ignore the growing suspicion that whatever had been trailing them had never been identified, never recorded, and never understood. The room grew colder as the implications sank in. Something had caused the crew to maintain course. Something had held the structure intact. Something had brought the submarine down without leaving a trace of struggle. As the ROV hovered in front of the conning tower and the team continued to record footage, the unease deepened. Every detail captured suggested intention, or at least a sequence of events that had unfolded with eerie precision. The discovery didn't answer the mystery. It expanded it in every direction. And as the feed played on, everyone watching understood that the real question was no longer where the submarine had gone, but how it had died in such a strange, silent posture. The final sweep of the night revealed nothing that made sense. No external damage, no evidence of implosion, no reason for the perfect vertical stance. When the ROV began its slow ascent back toward the surface, the team felt a hollow, quiet settle across the deck. They had found the Alden Ridge, but they hadn't found clarity. They had stumbled upon a riddle preserved in salt water and darkness, a wreck that should not exist the way it did. And as the ROV's tether reeled upward, one realization pulsed through the minds of everyone on board. The submarine had been found, but its final minutes were still hidden somewhere inside that steel tower rising from the seafloor, waiting for someone brave enough to look deeper. The discovery had changed everything, but the truth was still buried, sealed behind steel doors that had never been opened since 1943. And now, the Navy had to decide what came next. Long before the submarine was ever touched or moved, the forensics began. Not in a laboratory, not in a dive chamber, but inside a cramped control room aboard the research vessel, where analysts replayed the ROV footage in silence. Every frame, every pixel, every drifting particle was studied as if it held the last breath of a sailor. The atmosphere was heavy, almost reverent. The team understood that what they were looking at was not simply a wreck. It was the final resting place of 71 men who had been missing for 77 years. This was the closest anyone had ever come to their last hours. The footage of the conning tower and hull had already sparked countless theories, but it was the slow inspection of the internal sections, captured through open vents, fractured seams, and narrow access points, that began to tell a different story. Someone paused the video, zooming in on a faint discoloration on the starboard aft section. At first glance, it looked like random corrosion, the kind that appears after decades underwater. But when they enhanced the contrast and slowed the playback, the truth surfaced in a chilling burst of clarity. Scorch marks. Not from external impact, not from a torpedo strike. These were burn patterns that spread outward in irregular bursts, the kind formed by electrical fires inside cramped compartments. One of the engineers studying the footage leaned back and closed his eyes. He had seen the same kind of damage on training vessels that had suffered wiring failures, darkened patches where insulation had burned away, leaving behind charred outlines like fingerprints. The team searched for more clues. It didn't take long to find the second piece of evidence. Near the bow, just beneath the officers' quarters, another discoloration glimmered faintly against the steel. At first, the ROV had passed over it quickly, but now the analysts slowed the video down to almost a crawl. A jagged fracture line cut into the compartment where the electrical control systems would have been housed. Around the edges, the metal carried the same smoky discoloration. The pattern was unmistakable. The Alden Ridge had burned from the inside. Not an explosion, not sabotage, not an enemy hit. Something electrical had ignited, fast, violent, and silent. One of the Navy observers spoke softly, almost to himself. The submarine's patrol logs had mentioned the smell of burning insulation on 2 separate missions, years before its final voyage. The shipyard had reported repairs, but some of the crew reportedly still joked about the ghost spark that occasionally flickered along the control lines. Those jokes had stopped being funny now. When the analysts moved to the bowplane footage, the room's atmosphere tightened even more. They watched as the ROV lights traced the outer edges of the forward dive planes. The port plane sat normally, aligned for level navigation. But the starboard plane, the one that controlled the submarine's dive and ascent, was locked downward at a sharp angle, jammed. It was the kind of mechanical failure that kept submarine commanders awake at night. A downward-locked bow plane is a death sentence in the wrong situation. Submarines are built to dive smoothly, to angle themselves with precision. A jammed dive plane forces the bow lower and lower, pulling the vessel nose first into a descent that grows steeper with every passing second. With functioning electrical systems, the crew could override it. But with a fire in the control room, the electrical circuits shot, the main power flickering or dead. The analysts exchanged looks of grim understanding. One of them slowly turned toward the Navy technician and asked the question that everyone had been avoiding. Could this explain the vertical posture? The technician didn't answer at first. He simply stared at the frozen footage of the twisted bow plane. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Yes, a jam that severe, combined with a power loss, could trap the submarine in a nose-down trajectory it couldn't escape. And if it kept sinking at that angle long enough, if the ocean didn't crush it first, it could embed itself upright in soft sediment. It was a horrifying possibility, but it was also the first plausible explanation the Navy had heard in 77 years. The team shifted their attention to the internal battery compartment. Footage from the lower vent inspection captured a long, narrow fracture where the casing had buckled. Battery explosions on submarines weren't uncommon during World War II. A small leak, a bit of seawater, a jolt or spark, any combination could trigger thermal runaway, releasing toxic fumes and dangerous heat. The interior rupture now visible suggested the worst-case scenario. The batteries didn't explode outward. They overheated internally, warping the compartment and producing massive amounts of smoke. If this had happened during a patrol, the crew would have had minutes, maybe less, to respond. The senior forensic analyst began sketching the sequence on a notepad, voice tightening as the picture formed. A fire in the electrical control room, overheated batteries, a failing ballast system, a jammed bow plane, and a crippled electrical network struggling to keep the submarine level. The chain reaction was merciless. Somewhere during those final minutes, the emergency ballast system might have been activated, an automatic response to sudden angle changes or pressure shifts. But if it malfunctioned, as earlier logs hinted, it would have compounded the descent instead of distributing buoyancy correctly. That would pull the submarine even steeper, forcing the bow down, leaving the crew fighting physics, machinery, and the ocean simultaneously. The more they pieced together, the clearer the story became, and the harder it was to accept the human reality underneath it. The analysts dimmed the screen lights in the room, replaying the footage of the bow. In the quiet, one of them described what the crew might have experienced, not as speculation, just the emotional truth of what the evidence implied. It would have started with a sharp smell, burning insulation, then smoke threading through the control room, alarms buzzing, men running, someone yelling for the fire team, someone else trying to seal a bulkhead door, the submarine filling with the electric sting of burning wires and acid fumes from dying batteries. Within seconds, the lights would flicker, the hum of the engine stuttering, the bow beginning to tilt lower as the jammed plane forced the vessel downward. Men would brace themselves against the sudden angle, slipping on the steel floor, grabbing rails that burned hot from nearby wiring failures. Commands would have been shouted in rushed bursts. Vent ballast tanks, reverse the dive, try to level the bow, cut power to the burning section, anything to slow the descent. But a submarine is not a forgiving place. A small fire quickly becomes a catastrophe. Smoke would thicken, oxygen levels dropping, heat rising, the metallic groan of the hull bending against forces it wasn't built to endure. As the bow sank faster, the crew would have felt the pressure increasing. Every second mattered. Every breath tasted different, hotter, thinner, tinged with chemical burn. Someone might have tried reaching the forward battery room to isolate the damage, but the heat radiating from the compartment would have stopped them. Someone else trying to crank the manual controls on the bow planes, fighting gears jammed solid by mechanical failure. And all the while, the ocean outside grew darker, colder, heavier. The analysts sat in silence after the description. It wasn't drama, it wasn't fiction. It was simply the reality the sailors faced 7 decades earlier, a reality preserved in steel. Slowly, the technical team mapped out the final descent. With the bow plane locked downward, the submarine would have angled sharply. As the electrical systems failed, the crew would have lost the ability to counteract the dive. The heavier forward sections, torpedo racks, battery compartments, thick steel bulkheads, would pull the nose down like an anchor. The submarine likely dropped almost vertically, gaining speed as it fell. But instead of imploding from pressure, something else happened. The ocean floor rose up beneath it, not rock, not coral, but soft, thick sediment along a slope descending from an underwater ridge. The submarine struck the seabed like a spear thrown from the sky, driving its bow deep into the mud. The front third of the vessel buried itself instantly. The rest of the submarine snapped upright in a split-second pivot. Silt closed around the nose like a vice, holding it there, frozen, perfectly still. One of the analysts whispered that the crew must have been alive during the descent. The data suggested no immediate hull breach. The fire, the fumes, the failing systems, they would have been conscious for at least part of it. They would have felt the sudden stop. The forward compartments crushed, the lights dying completely, the submarine settling into eternal darkness. No one spoke after that. The reconstruction was almost complete now. Frame by frame, measurement by measurement, the evidence had erased decades of rumors, enemy attacks, sabotage, unexplained phenomena. The truth was more tragic and far more human. A cascade of mechanical failures, a fire that spread faster than the crew could fight it, and a desperate attempt to regain control of a vessel that no longer responded. The analysts reviewed the final shots captured by the ROV, the sealed hatches, the intact external hull, the charred inner compartments barely visible through fractured vents, everything aligned with the theory. And yet something in the room felt unfinished, as if the story still carried a hidden weight. The team replayed the hull footage one last time. Someone pointed out a detail almost unnoticed before. The forward ballast vents were open, fully deployed. That meant the crew had tried everything, every emergency procedure, every last hope to slow the descent. They hadn't panicked. They fought. Even in the chaos, even as the fire raged and the bow dropped like a stone, they followed training, discipline, instinct. They went down fighting their own ship's failures. As the forensic briefing ended, everyone in the room felt the same hollow ache. The mystery wasn't solved in the dramatic way old rumors had imagined. It was solved in a far more painful, grounded way. The Alden Ridge wasn't a ghost ship anymore. It was a place where men had struggled against impossible odds, where they had fought machinery, fire, and gravity with no rescue coming. What the footage revealed wasn't supernatural. It was human. And the truth carried its own weight, a weight that would follow the investigation into its next chapter, as the Navy prepared to face the hardest decision of all, whether to leave the submarine standing in its silent grave, or bring it back to the surface and confront whatever remained sealed inside. For almost 8 decades, the USS Alden Ridge had lived as a rumor, half-war story, half-ghost legend, discussed in the quiet corners of naval reunions and in the fading memories of people who had once waited for sailors who never returned. But now, for the first time since 1943, the Navy held proof, hard, indisputable evidence. The discovery that had stunned researchers and naval historians would soon ripple far beyond the walls of the forensic lab, reaching into living rooms and nursing homes and small town houses across America, places where the families of the 71 men had grown old, still wondering what had happened to their brothers, husbands, fathers, and grandfathers. The formal identification process began quietly. The Navy assembled a special task group to review the ROV footage and cross-verify the submarine's serial numbers, hull markings, and interior layout. Even before the analysts finished, everyone involved knew the truth, but protocol required a precise match. When the final verification came in, a perfect alignment of hull plates, conning tower rivets and internal structural beams. The room fell silent. The report was printed with a simple sentence at the top. Wreck confirmed, USS Alden Ridge, SS-241. It was the first time those words had appeared since 1943. The Navy began contacting next of kin, those who were still alive. In most cases, it wasn't sons or wives anymore. It was grandchildren, even great-grandchildren. Some families had moved across the country, others had never left the towns where the sailors had grown up. The notification calls were handled gently, with a sense of reverence. The officers made sure to speak slowly, to explain carefully, to pause whenever the person on the other end needed a moment to breathe. Some families cried. Others didn't say anything at first. One woman, the granddaughter of a 19-year-old torpedoman, whispered that she had grown up hearing only fragments of stories, how her grandmother used to sit on the porch every evening for years, looking toward the sunset as if waiting for someone who might walk down the road. The Navy officer told her that her grandfather's submarine had been found standing upright, as if still holding its place. The woman didn't answer at first, and when she did, her voice trembled. "It makes it feel like he never quit," she said. Another man, nearly 85 years old, broke down when he learned the submarine had finally been located. His father had been one of the senior crewmen. He had lived his entire life wondering if the ship had exploded or burned or been sunk by enemy fire. He had always imagined the worst. But when he heard that the submarine was found largely intact, standing straight on the ocean floor, he whispered that it gave him peace he never expected to feel in his lifetime. Across the country, these quiet moments unfolded one phone call at a time. Some families held small private ceremonies. Others gathered together to listen to the Navy's detailed explanation. And for many, the knowledge that the ship had not been destroyed by enemy fire, nor lost through negligence, brought a complex mix of comfort and heartbreak. The official report described the tragedy as a mechanical cascade, a chain of internal failures that grew unstoppable. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't an attack. It was a tragic, brutal accident. The Navy released a public statement shortly after the notifications were completed. It was brief, respectful, and ridden with emotion. The USS Alden Ridge has been located at a depth of 2,950 feet in the Pacific. All evidence points to an internal electrical fire followed by mechanical failures. The submarine's posture on the seafloor is consistent with an uncontrolled vertical descent. The wreck will remain undisturbed. We honor the 71 crew members who gave their lives during wartime service. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Footage from the ROV, dark, grainy, eerie, circulated around the world. Images of the upright submarine stunned viewers. It looked less like wreckage and more like a monument placed intentionally on the ocean floor, tall and solemn, as if defying time itself. Historians called it unprecedented. Some divers described it as a steel sentinel. Families said it felt like a message, something they didn't fully understand but could feel nonetheless. As public attention grew, the Navy coordinated a formal memorial service above the wreck site. Survivors of other WWII submarines were invited, along with families, military representatives, and the private oceanographic team who had made the discovery. The exact coordinates were kept restricted, but those invited were flown out to a naval vessel positioned directly above the resting place of the Alden Ridge. The day of the memorial was calm, the kind of calm sailors often say the ocean offers only on rare, meaningful days. The water stretched out in a soft gray sheet, unbroken except for the gentle push of the ship's hull. Family members gathered on the deck, some standing close together, others alone, leaning quietly on railings or holding photographs that had faded over decades. Some clutched medals. Others carried letters written long ago, on yellowed paper, addressed to men who never came home. When the ceremony began, there were no grand speeches, just a simple recounting of the submarine's service record, the names of the 71 crew members, and the newly confirmed cause of their loss. A senior naval officer read the final conclusions. An electrical fire, a battery failure, a jammed bow plane, an emergency descent that became uncontrollable, a final impact with the seabed that drove the submarine upright. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that belongs to the ocean, soft, deep, wide enough to feel like it stretches back through time. Some family members wept quietly. One younger man, a great-grandson of a crew member he had never met, said later that the silence felt like listening to all the voices that were lost, echoing in ways no one could hear but everyone could feel. A wreath was lowered into the water, then a second, then a third. Soon, the surface was scattered with small circles of flowers, drifting gently. One by one, family members stepped forward and placed roses on the water. Some whispered small personal messages. Others simply watched the flowers float, knowing they were resting above a place that had once been unimaginable and now felt sacred. A Navy chaplain spoke briefly, not about war or duty or sacrifice, but about closure. He explained that for decades, the absence of answers had created a silent burden passed down through generations. The submarine's discovery did not erase that loss, but it transformed the story. It gave the families something they had never had before: a place, a moment, an ending. After the ceremony ended, the ship stayed in position for several hours. No one rushed to leave. People stood along the railings, watching the horizon, their eyes drifting downward now and then, toward the invisible shape standing far below their feet. Some said it felt like the submarine was standing upright beneath them, holding its posture like a soldier at final attention. The Navy later declared the wreck a protected war grave. No salvage, no intrusion, no attempts to penetrate or disturb the interior. The Alden Ridge would remain where it stood, untouched, preserved, a monument to the men who had faced their final minutes with discipline and courage. Historians, oceanographers, and naval engineers collaborated on a comprehensive report that would be published the following year. It documented every detail of the forensic reconstruction: the scorch marks, the battery rupture, the malfunctioning ballast system, and the jammed bow plane that locked the submarine into an irreversible descent. The conclusion was clear and unanimous: no enemy involvement, no external attack. Just a catastrophic, tragic chain of mechanical failures triggered by a single electrical fire. The truth of the final moments was not sensational. It was human. It spoke to the fragility of life aboard a submarine, a world where a single spark, one broken valve, one jammed plane could turn an entire vessel into a steel trap with no escape. And yet, the fact that the submarine remained upright, towering on the seabed like a final salute, became something of a symbolic gesture among families and naval circles. One researcher who helped analyze the footage described it best. He said that seeing the submarine standing vertical felt like watching a moment frozen at the edge of tragedy and honor. A vessel that had refused to collapse into the mud. A ship that had gone down fighting its own failures, still holding its shape, still facing forward. In the months that followed, the discovery inspired a wave of renewed interest in lost WWII submarines. Other families of missing sailors reached out, hoping for their own closure someday. Search organizations expanded their missions, now equipped with improved deep scan technology and a new sense of possibility. The Alden Ridge had shown that some mysteries could still be solved, even after 77 years of silence. For the families directly affected, life didn't suddenly become easier. Grief doesn't evaporate just because the final chapter is known, but closure changes the shape of that grief. Instead of a question mark, there is now a period, quiet, heavy, and definitive. Many families described feeling an unexpected peace. Some said they dreamed more often of the men they had lost, but the dreams felt warmer now, calmer. Others said they finally felt permission to stop imagining the worst. The Navy placed a plaque at Pearl Harbor listing the names of the Alden Ridge crew, along with the date of its rediscovery and the confirmed cause of loss. It was visited daily by tourists and veterans who paused to read the names and often walked away with a quiet expression, touched by a story they had never heard before. The story of the Alden Ridge spread into classrooms, museums, documentaries, and books, not because of combat records or wartime heroics, but because of what the submarine represented: endurance in silence, honor in tragedy, a reminder that some stories take nearly a lifetime to reveal their truth. And in the end, when the world finally understood what had happened in those dark waters in 1943, the men aboard the Alden Ridge were not remembered as victims of war. They were remembered as sailors who faced their final minutes with resolve, discipline, and bravery, holding their vessel upright even as it descended into the deep. After 77 years, their story had finally resurfaced. The mystery was no longer a void. The ocean had given back its secret, and the Alden Ridge stood where it had always been, quiet, solemn, and unbroken, keeping watch over the place where its crew now rested in peace.